If you want to standardize the naming convention inside your Azure environment, the Azure Naming Tool is definitely a handy tool that can help you accomplish just that. Learn how to use the Azure Naming Tool on this MS Cloud Bros video. Hey, Jeremy Wallace here, Microsoft MVP certified trainer and solutions architect for Azure. And today on this MS Cloud Bros video, we're going to check out the Azure naming tool and exactly how to use it. But if you haven't seen it already, go check out my previous video in which we install the Azure naming tool inside a web app inside your Azure tenant. Then you can follow along. So let's dive right in. All right, so I'm in the Azure Naming Tool, and on a previous video, we installed this inside an Azure web app. As you can see it running here, I'm just using that default address that it gives me for that, but of course I could customize this myself. So I'm in here, I'm hitting the home page, and I'm logged in with my Entra ID user. This is just using an onmicrosoft.com account for this lab environment that I'm in. Once you're logged in, you need to also log in as an admin specifically into the Azure Naming Tool. So you'll hit this admin tab and you'll enter in the password that you used to set up the Azure Naming Tool in the first place. So enter in that password, and you have to specifically do this step in order to enable some of these additional fields for configuration. So standard users you can have logged in here with their Entra ID and they can create names, but to actually create that original naming scheme standard, you do that as an admin, and you're going to spend your time mainly inside this configuration tab. Now, under configuration here, we can see our base configuration component. So if I hit this drop down, this is all of the components that are involved in my naming scheme. So in another video, we'll talk a little bit more about what Microsoft generally recommends for your naming conventions, but it's spread apart into these components that you see here. And so we're choosing under this configuration what are going to actually comprise our names each time we name something. So for me, I'm not going to use orgs. I'm just like a single company. I don't have org delimitations. So resource types, I want that. So that's like virtual machine or storage, units and departments. I want to define that if maybe it's my IT department or my finance department. Project app services. So that'll help me delineate that it's a particular project that it belongs to or a particular application that it belongs to. Function, I think I would probably get that from projects, apps, and services. So I might choose to eliminate that aspect. Environments, that's going to be like my prod and test environment. Locations, that's going to be my regions, and instance, 1, 2, 3, so on. So those are the components that I want involved, and then I can order them here. If I wanted to have my resource type somewhere else, I could change that order. The higher up is going to be first in that, and then lower is going to be later in the name. So I do want resource type first. I'm a big believer in having that resource type as the first part of the name. And then I think department sounds good. Application, environment, location, instance. Yes, I think I like that order. And then we want to take a look at delimiters. Now, delimiters is what those components are separated by. By default, that is dash. They provide a few other alternatives here, so we could use like an underscore instead. So it would be for instance, if it was a virtual machine, I had my instance name first, so it'd be VM dash, or in this case, I just changed it to underscore. I actually do prefer dash, so I'm going to switch that back here, but you can choose one that you want to work with. Now, here's where you actually configure the individual components of your naming scheme. So environments, I can choose what environments are options, and when I go to name something, so I got my dev, my prod, my sandbox, my shared, staging, test, UAT. These are normal ones to see. For me, I'm going to get rid of UAT. I'm not going to use a UAT. All right, so those are my environments. And if there's additional environments you want to add, you can just add them in there directly and define them. There is additional configurations here, like you can convert to uppercase or lowercase, and then individually for components as well. You can change what the long name and the short name is. The short name is the actual part that's going to be put into the name. So if you abbreviate these differently, you can define that as well. Next, I'm going to take a look at locations. So locations, these are Azure regions that you're going to pick in the naming scheme. So if there are particular regions that you're not going to use locations, I would just remove them from this list. For instance, for this particular environment, I'm not going to be spinning up anything in Australia. So I may remove those. And then for my US-based ones, we can take a look at how they're abbreviated here. So for instance, my West US 2, West US 3, I actually prefer that naming scheme to be a little bit different. I prefer that to be abbreviated West US, just like the name says it directly. So I'll edit that. So it'll be West US 2, US 3. So it's up to you on how you actually want these to be formatted to your preferences. The main important part to the naming convention is that you standardize it. So whatever it is, you stick to it with everything that you do. So you can do what other organizations do as far as those abbreviations. You can customize them yourself. You can put completely different type of abbreviations in for those things. It's just important that you have it as a component. So again, I'm not doing orgs, project services. So if I know of particular projects or apps or services that I want to include here, so they include a sample here, I'm just going to include Azure Virtual Desktop. So we'll do AVD. We'll do test app 1. Get rid of this. Now this is sticking to a 3-letter convention. You can customize what the max is for that short name. You can't do it here. You can only customize what the short name is. You have to go back up to the actual components part. So if I minimize this, expand components, and go to apps, I can actually define here what the maximum and minimum length is. So if I want the maximum to be 10, I can have it in there. It is handy because of how long this can be with all the components to keep each of those segments short. So 3 is a great one. So have a 3-letter designation for your applications. All right, resource types. This is where you're going to spend the majority of your time, is defining what resources you want to use and what that naming scheme is. So for instance, let's take a look at computing, and let's take a look at virtual machines, Windows. So I can look at my naming scheme there. It's going to use VM as the default for that. So I can keep that. Again, I can customize how I want that. And so you're going to go through on resources that you utilize in your environment and define how you want that name to appear here. And a lot of the times the default's good. You may have individual preferences on how it should be named. And you can also remove components that you won't be introducing into your environment. I want to take a look at units departments here. So a couple of units departments I want to add is, of course, finance, IT services, resources, and I'll remove the sample one. Right. Environments down, locations down, project app services down, resource types down, units departments. Now let's take a look at my global configuration. After you configure that, it's important that you export this configuration, and it'll export that to a JSON. Just in case something happens to your application, you can go back and re-import these settings. If you have to build it from scratch, you can import that JSON file right back into here. And of course, if you ever need to just reset the whole thing, scorched earth, go back to the beginning, you can hit that reset button. That's right there. Okay, how do we use this thing? To do that, we go to generate. Now, under generate, we can do generate single resource type or generate multiple resource type names. I'm going to generate single resource type name, and then I'm going to pick my specific resource that I want to use. Again, let's do a common one. So let's just compute, and then I'm going to hit virtual machines. We're going to do a Windows. Then we see our naming guideline. The minimum length for an Azure VM name is 1, maximum length is 15. And then we have some components optional here, a unit, department, and then excluded is the org, because I chose not to have that here. So unit, department, for this I'm just going to choose IT services, and let's say this is for my test app, and this is going to be in my test environment. And locations, this is going to be in, let's say, East US 2. And instance, this is going to be my first instance. So then if I hit generate, we got a failure. Generated name is more than the maximum length of the selected resource type. Please remove the optional component. All right. So this one, I'm going to remove my optional component and then regenerate. Okay, success. So this is the name I was given. Generate a name, VM TA1 STEUS21. And I noticed that I am missing my delimiters. And that was because my name was so long. So the specified delimiter was removed. This is often caused by the length of the name exceeding the max length in the delimiters. If I want my dashes in there, then I'm going to need to pick shorter names for this. So keep that in mind when you're creating these naming components, some of the limitations that you're going to run in. All right, so I'm going to go back into configuration. Let's go to my resource type, and let's take a look at that compute virtual machine. So I'm going to make environment app services optional components. And now I'm going to jump down to generate. Let's try that again. So I'm going to do compute, and I'm going to do Windows virtual machine. And now I can see those additional pieces are optional. So I do want to keep that as part of the test app. I think it's important that we know that. I'm not going to put what environment it is, because we should be able to see that from the subscription if you're doing an Azure Landing Zones model. But I will put the location it is in, and the instance number. Let's generate. All right. So now we see it stick to my naming convention because I was able to keep that under 15 characters by keeping some things optional. So play around with the naming standards inside your environment to get your naming convention down exactly how you want it. And then when you generate these names, you can export that as a CSV file. So we can see I have it here, and I can see the actual generated name and what it was for, the resource type. So now instead of having to figure that out on the spot, I can plug this in directly into when I go create the resource in the Azure portal, or plug it into my ARM template or any other infrastructure as code that I might be using. And you can also go to this generated names log after you've produced names and see what was named. So it does keep that log. It will prevent duplicate names from occurring. So that's the great thing about that. And you can export all of these names too to get an inventory of what has already been named in your environment. Or if you ever need to purge this log after your testing, do that as well. But this also gives you the ability to go and see who in the world named this thing and track it out in that way. So that's an overview of how to use this incredible tool, the Azure Naming Tool, inside your environment. On another MS Cloud Bros video, we'll cover exactly what Microsoft's recommendations are for naming schemes and what are some of the native ways that we can enforce these naming standards inside our environment.